Okay, everybody ready to get started? All right, technical difficulties have us a little bit behind schedule, but very happy to finally launch into tonight's presentation from David Hurst Thomas. Uh, David is the senior curator in residence, the Division of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. Very much looking forward to the presentation on the survivance in the deep Great Basin past. Take it away, David.
All right. Well, let me thank you all for the invitation to join you. Uh, although I work at the largest natural history museum in the world, my ties are pretty much Great Basin and particularly to Oregon. My first professional paper I gave at a Great Basin conference in Eugene. My first dig in the basin was at Cougar Mountain Cave a while ago, and I've enjoyed coming back, and I appreciate the invitation tonight to share with you some recent stuff that we've been doing. Now, what I'm going to talk about tonight is pinyon pine, and you don't have it up there, but that's part of the story. Um, it's an incredibly important resource. It was kind of late in the science game. Juniper was recognized a long time ago scientifically, but pinyon pine was not until John C. Fremont cut through Nevada in 1844. And Samwashu, he was running low on supplies, and Samwashu offered him a bag of pine nuts. And while it didn't save his expedition, he said it sure helped them a lot. He fell in love with what he called this wonderful vegetable. And a couple of years later, with the Donner Party, survivors are credited with surviving literally on pinyon pine. Now, my interest in this is a project I've been working on for some time. It's an interdisciplinary project, and it's basically as we track the deep history of pinyon pine in the Intermountain West, and also look at the history of indigenous people, we see a tremendous correlation. Pinyon pine and people really did progressively and simultaneously move across the Great Basin. Now, I've approached this, as we do in a lot of our research, in an interdisciplinary fashion. And my partner in crime here is Connie Millar, who is a career forest ecologist. Uh, she has spent her entire career, 30, 40 years, working in the mountains of the Great Basin, particularly studying not just plants, but animals as well. Connie and I got together because I found this site called Alta Toquima, which is a 12,000 foot village site in central Nevada. And Connie helped us out with some of the significance of what was going on with limber pine and whatnot. So Connie and I published a number of papers about relating what's happened to pinyon pine over the last 10,000 years or so, and the people who so depended on pinyon pine during that same period. And here's the background. On the left here, you'll see a map, and the greenish area shows you the modern distribution of pinyon pine today. And you'll see uh, it's not up in Oregon. It's almost not in Idaho. It's basically going across the central part of Nevada with more or less the Humboldt River uh, defining its northern boundary. And then it goes down south into the Mojave Desert. Now, from the science side of this, the Western science side of it, we were very interested in understanding how this relationship came to be. So, what we were able to do is do typical Western science. How do we trace the ancient pinyon? This is the modern distribution on the left, but on the right, a great deal of research. We've done some, and others have done a lot more. But going back to fossil pack rat nests and dating pinyon fossils and tracking basically their route, how long have they been there? And that's what we're showing on the right. The red part at the bottom is the old part, and the blue arrows are pointing the way pinyon proceeded during the Holocene across the Great Basin, according to the Western science model. So here's what we think. Pinyon it was absent from your area and northern Nevada and Idaho because it was just too cold in the late Pleistocene. Pinyon instead had refuges down in the Las Vegas Mojave desert area during the Pleistocene, and during the Holocene, last 10,000 years, pinyon has migrated in a wave-like fashion northward as the climates warmed up. Now, I'm not going to do it today, but I can track through exactly what's going on in all of these areas with indigenous populations as well. So this is a paper that Connie and I gave at the Great Basin meetings. Actually, it was in Bend a couple of years ago. And I laid out pretty much what I've told you and also elaborated some on the archaeology. And after it was over, I was approached by a Western Shoshone elder. He said, "You're telling me that science believes that pinyon started down by Las Vegas and moved up north to its limits by the Humboldt River over the last 10,000 years." And I said, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." And he said, "My tribe knows that pinyon came from the north and moved south." Now, Connie and I both heard this, and we were floored. We couldn't believe how short-sighted we'd been. We prided ourselves in our interdisciplinary approach, a forest ecologist and an anthropological archaeologist working together, sharing information and coming up with hypotheses. Where was the indigenous voice in all this? We didn't even think about it. And this was, like I say, about 2.5 years ago. And so it flew in the face of everything else I was trying to do. I'm a huge Ned Blackhawk fan. He's a Western Shoshone scholar who's now a distinguished professor at Yale and has written some very important books. And he's absolutely right that indigenous history is essential to an understanding of the evolution of modern America. But we hadn't translated that into the natural history of pinyon pine. We thought we Western scientists were the ones who had something to say about that, and we were wrong. So it's all about listening. And you know very well in your part of the country the episodes involving Kennewick Man. And that was a tremendous difficulty across the country for a long time, and it was finally broken when the Colville tribe decided to go ahead and have their DNA tested to establish that Kennewick Man was, in fact, a Native American. Broke the case and proceeded to what they wanted, which was a repatriation. A very similar case took place near where I work at Spirit Cave near Fallon. We dug Hidden Cave there for years, and Spirit Cave is just about a half a mile around the corner. Spirit Cave Man is, well, I was going to say he's the world's oldest mummy, which was true until about 2 months ago. He's 9,400 years old. There has been more recent evidence found in China of some mummified person slightly older than that. But Spirit Cave Man was dug up in 1940 by the Wheelers, archaeologists working for the Nevada State Museum, and the local Fallon tribe took great exception to this, and when NAGPRA came along, they asked to have it returned because they said they were direct descendants of Spirit Cave Man, whom they call the storyteller. This is a picture of Donna Cassette, sitting inside Spirit Cave with the geneticist Esley Wildersev. Now, this is only the second time that Donna's been in that site because her tribe believes those places, there's a spirit sickness that you have to stay away from because you don't know what kind of person that was who was buried there. And if that person has not been treated right, like she felt Spirit Caveman was not treated properly, then they can come back and get you today. You don't mention their name. They call him the storyteller. But Eske was the geneticist who broke the Kennewick Man case. And he and Donna are talking, this is 15 years ago, about maybe doing the same thing in Nevada with Spirit Cave. But the funny thing, and which they did, and ultimately, the genetics established a relationship between living Northern Paiute people and Spirit Cave, and the repatriation took place almost 10 years ago now. It cost the tribe about $350,000 to get this done, but they knew what the answer was going to be. Now, the curious thing to me that came out of both the Kennewick Man case and Spirit Cave Man, in both cases, it was exactly the same statement from the Koval and from the Northern Paiute. It's not that they don't trust the science in doing the DNA case. In this case, they didn't trust the scientists. And it's no accident that both of these were taken to Denmark, to Copenhagen, to run the DNA because there is so much mistrust between local tribes and the archaeological community, which I belong to. So the question is, with this kind of animosity and history of it, Connie and I realized that we need indigenous voices if we're going to understand anything about the relationship of pinyon pine and people in the deep, deep past in the Great Basin. So how do we do that? Well, what we did was start talking to tribal members and explaining that we're Western scientists, but we really want to listen to indigenous voices and thoughts because we think there's a good likelihood we're missing something. So what we did was form a team. The two of us started adding people. Many of you may know Wilson Weewa, who is at Warm Springs. He's a Paiute living there. He joined up. Some of you know Dr. Diane Tiemann now. She just got her PhD at the University of Nevada from Burns. They both agreed to work with us. Donna Cassette, I just showed her picture from the Fallon Paiute tribe, is another willing member of what we're doing here. Herman Fillmore, who's a linguist with the Washoe tribe near Lake Tahoe for Nevada and California, and Misty Benner from the Walker Lake Paiute tribe. So over the last couple of years, the seven of us have worked together on what is the relationship, deep relationship, between people and pinyon pine in the Great Basin. We all presented a paper at the last Great Basin meetings in Reno a couple of months ago, and I'm pleased to say that a paper that we pulled together was just published 2 weeks ago in American Antiquity. If anybody's interested, let me know and I'll give you the link to it. It's out online right now. It's what I'm going to talk about today, and it'll appear in print whenever Cambridge can pull it together. But basically what we did was try to tackle this as a group. And we recognized specifically we've got really different ontologies here. Connie and I are Western scientists, trained very differently, but we're both scientists. And the other five are indigenous people who were trained in the traditions of their tribe. They speak for themselves, they don't pretend to speak for the tribe, but there's quite a diversity here. But in our conversations, it became clear we've got the scientific input. I've already talked about the radiocarbon dates and the what we're doing with the pack rat nests and all that kind of thing that we can work on. Tree rings, very scientific. Where does they? We're listening. what do you have to say to us about this? And the answer came out universally, our oral history. That's how we can talk about our past. It's how we know about our past. It's how we've learned about it. So what this paper, and there's a second paper that's accepted by quaternary research, which will be out, I think, next month or so, that they're parallel. The paper I'm showing you here talks more about the oral history. The other paper, and all seven of us are co-authors on that too, talks more about the deep science involved in that. But in our conversations, it was clear the key here to indigenous voices is about oral history, and so we decided to focus on that. Now, as a Western scientist, what's the input here? Well, I'm showing you a picture of Franz Boas. Um, he is the father of American anthropology. He dreamed that up in the 1890s in an office about three doors down from where my office has been since I came to the American Museum. And basically, what he said, it's a four-field approach, and we need to include archaeology as part of the anthropological approach. I've got 4 degrees, and none of them are in archaeology. They're all in anthropology because of Franz Boas. So, in the late 19th century, Boas was a curator at my museum, and he was also a professor at Columbia University. And he looked at what was going on in the American West from the Northwest down through the Great Basin in California and the rest. And he said, you know, the government policy, starting with Ulysses S. Grant, who laid the cornerstone to my museum in 1872, now has a policy to de-Indianize the Indians. Save the man, kill the Indians. Boarding schools, tribal people were taken all over the country. I'm very interested in Jim Thorpe. And when he went to Carlisle, part of that process, cut off their hair, don't let them speak their language, and particularly do not let them tell their stories, their oral history. We've got to eradicate that in order to make them some kind of functioning Americans. So Boas looked at this, and in his view, it was inevitable that Native Americans were going to disappear. So it was anthropology's job, Boas thought. We've got to save that information, and we've got to do it right away for the history of humanity. Not for the tribes, because they're not going to be here, but we have to somehow find a way to do it. So in 1901, he took his first and best student, Alfred Kroeber, who was working in the lab, which has been my lab for over 50 years now, and said, you are going to go, I know you've never been west. I'm going to send you to Nevada and Utah to record what is disappearing. 5 years later, he took another one of his students named Robert Lowy, also an employee of the American Museum and also a graduate student at Columbia University, and sent Lowy out to Nevada to do exactly the same thing. Uh, Lowy, both of these were city kids. Lowy had to learn how to ride a horse from the tribe he was working with so he could survive in Nevada. But in particular, Boaz coached them up. Find the storytellers. They're the ones that can tell you about the tribal past, and they're disappearing at a record clip with the off-reservation boarding schools and whatnot. Grover and Lowy and Sapir, all Boaz students did exactly that, as did their students, including Julian Stewart. Seek out the storytellers and get the stories. And they were very successful over that period of time from 1901 when Kroeber went out to about the mid-50s. This group of largely Boas students recorded about 1,000 indigenous stories. They're published broadly. Stewart has the ones that he has, these Western Shoshone ones, about 1,000. And what it certainly does, if you've got 1,000 tales, oral history, it certainly underscores the aphorism that it's not oral history until some white anthropologist writes it down. But that's what happened. Now, there's another side to the story, And that's the survivance part that I used in my title. Survivance is an indigenous term from Gerald Vizenor, and it's basically making the distinction between survivance and survival. Survival is just doing anything to get by. But Vizenor made the distinction there's more to it than that in indigenous America. Survivance is not just dominance and tragedy and victory. There is survivance is sort of survival with an attitude. It's keeping their beliefs alive and carrying them on in spite of difficult odds. So the survivance part of that also plays in here pretty heavily. Indigenous people in the Great Basin started recording their own oral history. This is largely a result of the Red Power movement that cropped up and the Alcatraz occupation in the 1960s and carried on. But tribal newspapers, tribal languages flourished, recording the tribal offices that I'm familiar with in Nevada have hundreds of oral histories recorded from storytellers, and they started making them available to other people. Nevada Indians speak. So it gives us a second body of oral history. We have one from white science, um, Western science, and we have another one from the indigenous side. And included in our cast of characters here, part of our team, Wilson Wewa, a little less than 10 years ago, published a book talking about the legends of the Northern Paiute, including something that's relevant here. So all of us were talking, all seven of us. How do we proceed? Well, we proceed by listening to the oral history that has survived. And what we realized is there is a story coming out of those 1,000+ stories that have been recorded that's actually very common. And it's called the theft of pine nuts. And it's literally talking about how pine nuts came to Indian country a long time ago. Theft of pine nut stories, we've got 61 of them now. The first one was recorded in 1873 by John Wesley Powell. He's famous, of course, for going down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, but he was also he was the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, but he was also the founder of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian. Fairly fluent in Ute and Northern Paiute. He first heard theft of pine nuts told to him, like I say, in 73. And it's a story about Coyote and his animal pals before there were human beings. Basically, theft of pine nuts starts out. There was no opinion before humans, but Coyote and the animal people could smell pine nuts cooking far away, and so they went to steal some. Although the land was covered with an ice sky, lightning hawk, before people, one of the ants, animal people, could break through the ice. When they finally got home, Coyote was chewing the stolen pine nuts and spitting them all over the ground where they grew, and that's where pine nuts came from. Now, working with our five indigenous co-authors, we've been able to track down 61 versions of the theft of pine nut tales. And this is our best guess, working together about exactly where each of those stories was told, where Coyote and the other animal people went from to where the pine nuts were and brought them back home and created them there. Every one of our five indigenous consultants heard theft of pine nuts when they were growing up. So we see that as a pretty powerful indigenous voice to complement the Western science that we're doing. Now, the question, of course, is what does tribal oral history, how can that help Western science know anything about the deep history of pinyon pine? Well, not surprisingly, there's considerable debate about that. From an indigenous side, we hear it very often. This isn't just a story, it's a true story. And then you read Robert Lowy, who spent years recording exactly this oral history. In 1915, he published 70 pages of Northern Paiute oral history, and then he couched that by saying never attach to oral traditions any historic value whatsoever under any conditions whatsoever. It's all myth. It has nothing to do with science. And many people still believe that. What we've done is generate our own perspective. We believe that used judiciously and in conjunction with independent forms of collaboration and ways to be wrong, we think that tribal oral histories offer fresh and independent ways for Western scientists to test hypotheses, confirm, refute, expand, whatever the judgments are that come from science against what we consider to be valid information sources from the indigenous past. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of what we think we're learning from that. One part has to do with biodiversity. This is really what Connie does for a living, is study the distribution of both plants and animals through the Intermountain West. Well, the 61 versions of theft of pine nuts mentions 24 mammals and 17 birds and 6 reptiles and 1 fish. But each of these is located in a place. So if we work through what science says about the distribution, the biodiversity in the past, we can compare that with what the indigenous science is telling us. This is a shot about wolves, and it tracks very well what science says about the distribution of wolves at the contact period and what the indigenous history says about wolves in the deep past. Another example is the ice barrier. This was gigantic, and it's part of about 3/4 of the theft of pine nuts story. This is one account where they traveled until they came to an ice blockade. It stood from the sky to the earth. Coyotes people looked up. They couldn't figure out any way to get around it, and it blocked the mountains. It was all ice. They stopped there, and they couldn't move across until somebody figured out a way to get through it and bring the pine nuts back home. As I say, it's a major feature of theft of pine nuts. So the question, from a Western science point of view, where did these storytellers see ice that looked like that went from the sky up into the mountains, totally impassable? Well, we can look to Western science for some answers there. Could it be the recent ice age, last couple hundred years ago? No, it can't. That's not it, because this is a shot of what it looked like in 1883, and it only occurred in 3 Great Basin ranges. So it couldn't possibly be remembrances from the Little Ice Age. No barriers, restricted to 3 places, not ice barriers. This is near Mono Lake. Well, could we take it back further? Could we look during the neoglacial period, which is about 3,000 years ago to a couple of thousand years ago? We know things got very cold, glaciers built in the mountains, and Connie, one of her great contributions to science is tracking the glaciers that are so obvious in the Sierra Nevada and their history into the Great Basin and finding that very often it wasn't ice itself, but glacial ice under the rocks, moving rocks. These rock glaciers, she's mapped now in, I think the number is 46 different ranges of the Great Basin, but there's as pervasive as they were during that wetter time period, there's no chance that this is what indigenous storytellers were talking about. No ice barriers here. We have to go all the way back, way back into the late Pleistocene and the ice caps that are something on the order of 10,000 to 16,000 BC to have anything that's Western science says is out there that these storytellers could have seen. And the problem is that this deglaciation in the Great Basin, and here we're looking up at Steens Mountain in Oregon, uh, basically was complete by 15,000 years ago. So the question, or the conclusion, I guess, that the seven of us came up with is this motif has such a deep memory in the oral narratives, 15,000 years, it has to be that old. But were those eyewitness accounts of Great Basin glaciers like that, or were these remembrances from the Arctic? We have no way of knowing. Now, let's get back to what is one of the most important parts of our study. Here again, on the left, you can see each of these numbers represents one of the theft of pine nut tales that we've been able to record where we think the stories were actually told, all 61 of them. And as I mentioned, all five of our indigenous collaborators heard these stories growing up. They're still being told. And look at the distribution that I showed you of pine. Pinyon pine across the Great Basin. It pretty much stops along the Humboldt River. It does not come up into Idaho and barely in Idaho and not in Oregon at all. But lots of the stories do. So what's that mean? Well, there's an area up here that I've circled that the stories are telling us that Western science has it wrong. When we reconstruct our history that I showed you over the Holocene of how pinyon pine is moving out of the Mojave Desert up into the central mountain ranges over the last 10,000 years, what it's telling us is exactly what that Western Shoshone elder told me 2 years ago in Bend. Our tribe knows it came from the north, and these stories that I've enumerated over here on the left back that up. So, what's that mean? We've got a difference between what Western science has said so far and what indigenous science has said for a long time. Here it is. Western science on the left, that's the theory I laid out before, moving up through the Holocene and stopping where it did. But if you look at the red numbers on this, you can see all of these accounts. They're not independent, but all of these accounts that are saying the animal people stole pine nuts in these places, including several in southeastern Oregon and across Idaho, and particularly in the northern part of Nevada. Now, how do we account for that? What do we do with that disparity? Well, Connie and I had published a couple of papers arguing uh, the Western science case. What we're seeing now is we've got three areas in particular, one overlapping into Oregon, one on the Nevada-Utah border, and the other up in eastern Idaho, that we think it's entirely likely that science has missed pinyon pine forests that once grew there. They may have moved up during the Middle Holocene, during the altithermal, whatever it was. We've got no scientific evidence, and most of our scientific evidence, and I'm showing here on the left, comes from pack rat nests. Well, it turns out pack rat nests are not preserved in this area. They don't preserve up north of the Humboldt River, and we're starting to ask the question, could we have missed it? Could Western science have missed this? And so I will tell you, Connie Millar is an Olympic athlete if they had mountain climbing as an event. For the last 30 or 40 years, she has peaked every mountain. But this entire last summer, what she's been doing is listening to the tribal oral histories about how science might have missed the actual origins of pinyon pine. So she's got an incredible program going back. She's actually, being a botanist, going back, how do we know the Western science history of pinyon pine? Well, let's go back to the herbarium vouchers. Let's find the records that go back into the 40s. Let's go back and look, because there's another pinyon. This is single leaf pinyon I've been talking about, but edgeless is another one that goes down in Utah and Arizona, and there's a margin here. And what she's finding, particularly in the last couple of months, is Western science has the distribution of these plants wrong. And if you go and you do the tree ring work and you actually do, we're doing the genetics of those now, it looks like the indigenous oral history has a better shot at explaining this than the Western oral history that we were raised in. So what's this mean? Well, our conclusions are pretty straightforward. We think that the oral histories and the scientific evidence that we certainly see a lot of corroboration and to some degree extension of mammal and bird ranges. We see definite signs of pinyon expanding north of the current range, which no Western science had supported before. And it provides new areas for us to look at historic northern pinyon locations. And we think, and this will be controversial, that we think some of these stories are so ancient that they may go back 15,000 years and were transmitted through time and space. So the ice barrier, we think those are oral history accounts that have some validity. And what they're doing is providing, we're not saying they're right, but what they're doing is providing another proxy. And that's what, of course, we all do is we work from proxies about something you can see and then what it means. And so we can say, regardless of where this goes, the indigenous input to Western science is showing things, new questions that we ought to be asking. We're doing that right now. Uh, we're going back through the unpublished herbarium records. We're seeking out midden sites that unrecorded that may have evidence of pinyon. We're reanalyzing all the existing pollen for pinyon because we think it is possible to tell different kinds of pinyon pollen apart. And we're considering lots of additional proxies, including the distribution of birds dependent on pinyon and doing starch analysis to look for evidence of pine nuts. So that's what our paper that came out a couple of weeks ago is arguing. And as I say, the one in quaternary research, it'll be out in a couple of months, is going to make the same case even stronger from a scientific point of view. We think it's will be controversial, but we also think that there's a good reason that Western science needs to listen better to indigenous science and make it work better for the tribes to work with us so we're not so mistrusted anymore. That's what we've been up to. And I just want to end with kind of a shout out to Tom Connolly and Caitlin McDonald and Lauren Davis for the work they've done with archaeologists and tribal input. I've always felt that Oregon was way a step ahead of us. I'm sort of a native Nevadan stuck at a natural history museum in New York, but we feel like we're following those trails and hopefully we're making some progress. Thank you. Now, I would be happy to entertain questions if that's a possibility here.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Thanks very much for that talk. That was That was fantastic. I love hearing the word listening so much in your talk. Seems like a really important word for everybody right now. Uh, question, Harvey. Yeah.
Question: what was the nutrition value of those pinion nuts, protein, vitamins, or has that been broken down? How much nutrition that provides? And is this pinyon pine, is that related to other pines? Have you had an ancestor of other pines in the western U.S. or in the Basin area? For example, like on Cascade Mountains, that area? Is that relate? How are they related?
Well, they're distantly related. The pinyon pines I'm talking about are confined largely south of there. Nutrition-wise, they're extremely high, but Connie and I have a paper we did a couple of years ago. Uh, we think actually it's much more complicated than that. There are different kinds of pine nuts. By tracking through those paths that we'd set up from the pack rat nests, it's very clear that pinyon pine came in early on the eastern slope of the Sierra Cascades and then moved much later through the Central Great Basin. Early enough to where they're vastly different, even though they're the same species. The ones that have been there a long time have incredible amount of predators, and that's something the ethnographic literature talks about all the time, and our indigenous colleagues too. When they go out pine nutting, they've got a lot of competition with the birds and the rodents and everybody else, and we've got an argument that we think the more recent pine is a lot easier to get. The more ancient pine, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago is much more expensive to get. And what they have to do to beat the predators is harvest those when they're green and then process them. There's a long argument in Great Basin archaeology about green and brown processing, and we think that's an evolutionary process.
Okay. Any other questions in the room? Yeah.
Is there a climatic hypothesis for uh, why the pinyon trees might have moved south from being further north? How could they have survived if it was so cold?
Well, that's an issue. And one hypothesis, particularly Connie's working on, is thinking maybe during that middle Holocene, the hypsothermal, what we used to call the altithermal, it could have, there could have been opinion extensions that came in even up into your country that could account for those stories. But there's no physical evidence for it. That's what we're looking for right now. So that would be a climatic input that's in the middle Holocene, 5, 6,000 years ago.
Hey, any other questions? Yeah. Renee.
Hi, I have a question about the semantics, I guess. You used the term indigenous science. Can you help me understand how we use that term or where that comes from?
This comes from our collaborators. And what their argument is not that I said we have very different ontologies about cause and effect and how things are happening, but it's a term they like to use so it's not discounted uh, as just myth. I should mention here a lot of what I just talked about came from my collaboration with Vine Deloria, and had Vine lived, he would have been one of the co-authors on this paper. But he's got a great quote about how the term myth just kind of blows off. It's used by scientists for storytelling by people with kind of underdeveloped minds, and it makes it convenient to ignore that. And it's a very sensitive point with our collaborators. They feel they have hard evidence in their oral history. And I think what our studies, our two papers are showing is there is a quote scientific uh, element to it that is showing some of the Western science may be wrong. That's what we mean by that.
Okay, this is Kathy Poet Chat. I'm wondering what the response to this information from the scientific community you have received.
That we're going to see. The first paper came out 2 weeks ago. The second paper is going to come out in a couple of 3 months. I think reading the literature, I think, we go back to Lowy's quote from 1915, no use whatsoever, no science. And that really conditioned the way most of the archaeologists working in the Intermountain West approached oral history. We're making another case, and there are several others around the country as well, saying we need to pay attention to this. Yeah, and sometimes, well, look at Crater Lake. There are indigenous accounts of what went on at Crater Lake, Mount Mazama, 7,000 years ago, but it took a long time in Oregon to catch up with the value of that oral history as eyewitness accounts. We've got an indigenous Washoe account of a tsunami that swept across Lake Tahoe. They've got accounts of it, and we have good geology that shows it's 12,000 years old. So I think right now it's going to be controversial. I think there are going to be a number of zealots like me who think we ought to do more listening and more testing of our own science with indigenous thoughts in mind. There are going to be others, and I have lots of colleagues who feel this way, that think this is all bunk and it's ridiculous to question science on the basis of myths. And I think there's a third group that is basically saying, again, what I'm saying, we've got to listen. And we can test hypotheses here. We can be wrong, which is what science is all about, but we don't automatically discount it. So I think it may stir stuff up a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Any other questions? Okay, one more.
Hi, I was wondering, talking about the evidence, archaeological evidence of pinyon pine, why is it that pack rat nests are the thing that you look for? Is there any other way that those seeds are preserved?
Well, we find them, of course, on archaeological sites all the time, and we've got dates for those. The pack rat, and we're doing a lot of research right now, particularly with the University of Utah group on starch analysis. So we're seeing exactly what was on those ground stone that we get. But the idea with a pack rat nest is to go back pre-archaeological, where you don't need people to convey those into an archaeological site because the pack rats do a good job of it. Um, there is a limitation because they're not preserved very far north. And we haven't seen any of that taken into consideration yet.
Okay, a couple more questions. Harvey?
Was the how long does these pinyon pines live, and also the needles on the pinyon pine tree? I understand that like fir needles, they have cooked it, and you can get a lot of nutrition out of even the needles. And has that been done with the pinyon pine?
No, it's not. The pigeons can live 200 or 300 years. And that's a lot of what my colleague Connie Millar is doing the tree ring analysis of all of that. Uh, but it's the nuts that are the key.
Okay, one last question, I think. Maybe two more.
What about the pack rat nests found at like Fort Rock in Oregon?
No, no, what was your quote? What about those?
Have there
Are
been
there?
pinyon pines found in the Fort rock?
Oh, we've been doing a lot of work with Dennis and others trying to see if we can track pinyon pine into the Paisley Caves, and uh, yeah, we're taking a hard look at that. So far, we haven't been able to do much about extending that boundary that way, but uh, Caitlin's been helping with that to some extent. I think going back and looking again with kind of fresh eyes at the paleo botanical collections. I know Dennis has some very early ones in Paisley, but the question is, which pine is it? And it's hard to tell. Uh, and so we're certainly looking at all of that, but we haven't found much to hang our hat on yet.
Okay. Michael? Yeah.
Have your collaborators of the indigenous people, have they been learning from, I mean, how receptive are they to the Western analysis of what those finds are? Are they gaining more interest in your own discoveries and some of the Western thoughts that were presented before this and incorporating it, or do they just kind of want you to listen to what they have to say about the role of indigenous, not mythologies, but narratives?
Yes, all that's true. Uh, we we've worked with our five colleagues. There is still a real mistrust of science, and particularly as they know scientists, they know we have theories, and some of the theories contradict. And over the past, we didn't have Spirit Cave Man was not repatriated because we have a linguistic theory that says the Paiutes have only been there 1,000 years. How could they be related to someone 9,400 years old? So there's still a lot of resentment about that part of science, American science. But what we're doing is trying, at least with our collaborators, what we do is treat our collaborators like professionals. Radiocarbon, I don't do my own radiocarbon date. I have a professional do that, and we work with them, and we're approaching them the same way. They are experts in what we're talking about, and they need to be compensated and treated as colleagues. So we've got this study, and these couple of papers are finishing, but the seven of us are working on another project all together, uh, kind of looking at well, what it really is looking at is some of you are aware, I showed Kroeber's picture. You know, Kroeber went on and established anthropology in California, and the University of California, Berkeley named Kroeber Hall after him. Kroeber's name was taken off Kroeber Hall about 5 years ago because indigenous California communities were so irritated with the way anthropologists had treated them. So what we're doing, all seven of us, is asking, is it like that in the Intermountain West? There's really a rough history of what anthropologists have done there, and how do we address this and make it look better 10 years from now?
Okay, I think that wraps up the questions. Dr. Thomas, thank you very much for such an interesting talk. Really appreciate it. Another round of applause.
My pleasure. Thank you all for inviting me. Fun.
Okay, great. So that concludes our January meeting. The next OAS meeting will be Tuesday, February 3rd. We're welcoming Bob Cromwell from Bonneville Power Administration. And his projected talk is the day-to-day work life of a federal archaeologist. What does a Bonneville Power Administration archaeologist do? So hope to see you all back here then. Have a nice evening.